And thank you, all of you, for coming. Of course, the understanding of Canada and our image of Canada is very much influenced by our history, and there is no better example of that than the recent discussions with the First Nations about the extent to which the 150th is, in fact, something to celebrate. My contribution is going to draw on both economics and history. The kind of work I do is looking for patterns in the past. So I'm different than most historians. I don't really care very much about individuals. I want to know the systematic tendencies, the generalizations. Not just any pattern, of course, things that seem interesting for some reason. Sometimes the motivation is a point at issue in history. Sometimes it's from the social sciences, more often from the social sciences. Of course, historians use a wide variety of sources. Here that you can, some of these, if any of you have done genealogy, you may have in fact used these kinds of sources. This is in fact a University of Guelph student. This was an Ontario Agricultural College student who enlisted in World War I. He's from Eastern Ontario. He was in his mid-20s, and at the beginning of the war, he left his studies to enlist in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. 600,000 plus people did that, and those records then are available to us for analysis. That's one of the sources that we can look at. We can also look at prison records. This is a picture of the Victoria Jail, Victoria, BC, in 1870. The photographer took it very low to the ground to make it look like quite an imposing building. It's actually not quite that big. And it's no longer there. It's now a shopping quadrant. This is what you get when you have a jail. You have to keep records of who's in the jail. And again, some of you may have seen these kinds of records. So you can see the kind of information we acquire about individuals. Not just name, their occupation, physical descriptions, their religion, nationality. This particular jail began recording not just height but weight by the late 1890s, or late 1880s. So this is a source that is going to be used eventually to understand the origins of the obesity epidemic, because we have this population that we know their BMI going back a long time. So this is because the page is too wide to photograph across. You can see, and you do get their what they did wrong, their offense, their sentence, their punishment, and this register is very good about keeping a record if they've seen this person before. So there's some of these are identified as having been seen before. Of course, if they were in a jail somewhere else, they might not know. But at least in this jail, they do keep track. And that, in turn, allows for, if one is interested, some analysis of recidivism. What kinds of people in the past are those who come back to jail repeatedly? In 1865, the jail was just started. It was built in 1864, so this is one of the very first registers here. And I show it to you. It's much harder to read. But you can see the individuals. Dick, a Stickeen Indian. Someone down, this is a Fort Rupert Indian. This is a Haida. So we're getting ethnicity markers. We're finding out that this jail included the First Nations, large numbers of them. Most of them we know now from assembling a database came from Vancouver Island and from the coastal areas close, the islands of the Gulf and the coastal areas close. But they allow us to get patterns like this. So this is just raw data of who gets put into jail, categorized by their ethnicity. And you see a couple of things. One, in the 1880s, there's this big upsurge. A lot of people went to jail in the 1880s. Sometimes when that happens, it's because there's a new legal regime, a punishment regime, a law and order sheriff comes to town. In this case, it's more likely, in fact, economic change on the West Coast. So the 1880s is when the Canadian Pacific Railroad reaches BC, and there is in fact a building boom, a big building boom on the West Coast in the early 1880s. So lots of people are coming through, and a fair number of transients presumably, and a fair number of Chinese coming in as well. The part of what is striking to me is the dark blue are those who can be identified as First Nations. And not everybody you can tell. So there will be some we've missed here. But in fact, it's about a third of the entries over this whole period. It's a really big share. So that if we think of ways in which whites and Indians interacted on the West Coast, the judicial system and the jail is a big part of it. They're a very significant presence in the jail. And just a side, even bigger presence amongst women. So the proportion. So this is for everybody, but if we did this for women, they'd be even a bigger proportion. That's partly because the Europeans who are on the West Coast and the Chinese who've come across as laborers across the Pacific are largely male. But there's a relatively normal sex balance in the Indigenous community, and that's why you get lots of women. Another source used a lot for systematic studies, church records. These in fact are English parish registers. We have in fact in Canada a really important collection of church records in what is now Quebec, New France. The Catholic Church began keeping records early on, and it turns out that the population of New France is among the very best documented in the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. They did censuses, which I'll come to in a minute, but they also had all these church records. And the church records have been used for various purposes. And here's an illustration of how you can use these kinds of sources. So in a marriage register, you can see what age people are when they marry, and it allows you to identify that the average age of first marriage in New France is 21 years in this period for women. In France itself, it's 23. So women are marrying younger in New France. Life expectancy is greater in New France. So counting from the age of 20, how long do people live on average? 40 years in New France. In France itself, 34 years. So that in turn means that as people live longer, then if one partner dies, since death does come early and one partner dies, people are still young enough to remarry. So the rate of remarriage is very high in New France, much higher than in France. All of that giving rise to much higher fertility, much bigger families in New France. And this is why we think, and this really comes out of the Quebec history literature, that in the same period that France itself stagnated, its population didn't change in the 17th century, and it was subject of much concern at the time in France. But at the same time, the population of New France was expanding rapidly. And we can see part of why this is. Not only did people live longer in New France, but the average number of children to a woman who marries is greater. And it doesn't matter if you look at the people who marry as teenagers or the people who marry in their 20s. There's a difference between what's happening in France and what's happening in New France. And that, by collecting up the data from all these parish registers and integrating with their censuses too, the demographic historians in Quebec have been able to put together this very precise picture of an important international contrast. So, for me though, I'm interested in censuses. I'm interested in, think of the broader category as social lists, inventories, and long history of these. The Roman Empire took something like a census. They did it, of course, for tax purposes. They wanted to be able to figure out how much they could extract from every population they conquered. We all know of the Doomsday Book, one of the earliest censuses in, the earliest we know of in England. And it's, why was it there? Why did it happen? Because England was invaded by the French. The French wanted to obtain a clear sense of what were the resources they had acquired control of. For tax purposes, for military purposes, they wanted to know what they had. So they went out and did this very systematic inventory of resources in their newly acquired territory. And we'll come back and see that again, that kind of pattern again in a minute. Of course, since the 1086, there are lots of changes in Europe, and some of the intellectual changes favor me. They favor the counting of people, which is what I find useful. And this is really part of the Enlightenment. The European Enlightenment brought out ideas of society, of collectivity, made up of individuals. And that in turn fed into mercantilist thinking. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there's considerable, as you probably know, warfare, conflict among the European powers. They were fighting each other a lot. And they knew that the size of their population was directly related to how big an army they could support. So one of the key elements of mercantilist thinking in the 17th century, in fact, is that the more people you have, the better. So that's part of why they start, again, they go into more accounting. So there's in England, a fellow named Gregory King made a big social inventory. We don't know how he got his data, so he might have made it up for all we know, but anyway, he circulated this around, and we still talk about him. In fact, this is a kind of a bigger process, and all of the European nations are struggling to acquire territory overseas. They're convinced that having colonies is going to help them in their conflict within Europe, and that's not to say they were right. There are some schools of thought that says you could actually lose money on having colonies, but they thought they should have colonies. And again, just as the French, after invading England, the Europeans, when they invaded the Americas, they wanted to inventory their territory. They wanted to know what they had. And in fact, that was hard. It's a non-trivial challenge. Partly because the overseas territories, in the case of North America, so the English and the French and the Dutch together acquired all of North America and Spanish. So a relatively small part of Europe acquires a very big territory. It's not been mapped. They can't go to the library and pick up some maps to figure out where to send their enumerators to. And the people themselves, the first settlers, the First Nations, the Aboriginal populations, they're moving around a lot. It's a very mobile society. So, and it's growing quickly. So this is actually a very tough environment to inventory. And it turns out that the very first censuses, the very first enumerations in the Americas by Europeans were done in Canada. And this is the French in New France. This guy, Jean Talon, as an administrator, began the first census in 1666. And then, so what did he find in 1666? So it turns out that in 1666, New France had 3,215 people in roughly 500 families. And of those roughly 3,000 people, half were in Montreal, Quebec, Trois-Rivières. So I don't know what he did with this information, but he went to some effort to get it. Of course, the counting here is ignoring the Aboriginal population. He's systematically excluding them from the society that he's inventorying. He and his descendants in the French administration took 15 more enumerations Between 1666 and 1760, in less than a century, they took 15 more enumerations. And that really is the beginning of census taking in North America. And we get it from the French, essentially. With the defeat of the French by the British in 1760, of course, the story we know, what happens when the British take over? Well, the British, in fact, took over a lot of French traditions. The French language remained in what became Quebec. The Catholic Church remained an important institution. And the British kept on taking censuses, just like the French. They took over this French tradition of census taking. So we get 15 more enumerations in the next little while. Simultaneously, there are censuses going on in Europe. The first complete population inventory that we still have the records for is Sweden in 1749, it turns out. I've not looked at these records. The first US census is 1790. The Americans are pretty early into this too. Britain, in the modern sense of a census, is 1801. But what that's doing for us in Canada is there are other models for this kind of information gathering that we're going to be able to draw upon. We have the French tradition, and we certainly use it. But as in most things, we know we watch the Americans, we know what they're doing, and we know what the British are doing too. The first censuses just picked up heads of household. So you'd be told that here's a household, the head is so-and-so, he's a farmer, and he has 3 boys, 2 girls, and his mother-in-law lives with him. And that's all you know in the early sense. So they're not very detailed. The first census to really try to capture everybody in the Anglo-American world is the English and Scottish census of 1841. 1851, everybody's doing it. The American census of 1850, the Canadian census of 1851, we're all enumerating everybody. It's not a per family basis, it's each person is important in herself or himself. This is, where is this? Puslinch Township, I think, in 1851. And here you see the listings. This is anybody who's done genealogy, you've seen these things a lot probably. The first full family is starting, it would seem, here. This guy's a farmer, he's got a wife, then he's got family that comes after it. This daughter is a daughter of somebody on a previous page. One thing and the reason to start with this is this column of religion, which it's really quite unique. So the Americans never enumerate religion. The British never enumerate religion, but we do it from the start in Canada. It's important to us, I guess, and one can start to think about, is it this mixing of French and British, the Protestant and Catholic, that drives it? I don't think I know. But it gives us data about an aspect of life that was very important to people in the 19th century that you cannot get for any other society. So research on Canada is important in a bigger sense for this reason. And one thing you do see is you look down the list of all the religions, and these are neighbors. So this is somebody's going down a rural concession and picking up families one by one, and they're all interspersed. We don't have religious defined or church defined ghettos in Canada. People are intermingled, and we can see that pretty clearly from the census. When we talk about censuses, this first one in 1851, after we get one 10 years later, so the tradition of a decennial census in Canada, we're still doing it. 2021 will be the 18th consecutive decennial census. So it's a process that, in some sense, is a long-standing process. There are changes along the way. One change is we keep on adding more territory. So the very first census of the Canadas, essentially it's southern Ontario and southern Quebec. 1871, we add PEI. No, we don't have PEI. We had Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. 1881, we had PEI, Manitoba, British Columbia. Although in the case of Manitoba and British Columbia, it's really just the very southern parts. 1891, we're really enumerating a good bit of the West. And by 1901, we've got all of the North and the West. So if you think of this map, the pink area is what we had at Confederation and what got enumerated in 1871. Gradually, over the next 30 years, we kept on expanding the area that we were doing this enumeration of. And there's a caution in this. It's obviously great that we came to have information about all of this, but it does mean that if we want to do comparisons between years, we have to be a little bit careful because we're comparing apples and oranges to some extent. The Canada in 1871 is that little pink thing down there. The Canada in 1901 is almost everything that you see. So it's a different kind of story in some sense. There are differences in the censuses themselves, what information is accumulated. So this is 61 again. This is Toronto in the St. Lawrence Market area. And what was done in cities is they take around these pages and just leave them off at people's houses with instructions to fill them out. Then they come back and pick up the stuff afterwards. Because of that, the information is probably a little bit rough here. We have trouble using the urban enumeration in 1861 for that reason. Small towns, though, were enumerated on essentially a rural form that the enumerator himself, and they were all men, the enumerator himself filled out. So here's one from Guelph in 1861. Some of you will recognize the name of John Howitt. This is John Howitt, the son. He was a physician, the son of the Quaker who came from England. This guy was born in England, but many of his siblings were not. What you're seeing here is information on, this column says colored person, mulatto, or Indian. So here's an inventory that you didn't have before. You find out who's in school, who's attending school. You find out if people can read or write. And you also get quite precise information about the housing stock. So John Howitt, coming from a very wealthy family, the people who don't know this, his father was said to be the largest landowner in Wellington County for a time. He's living in a frame house. He's not in a stone house. The only person in a stone house down at the bottom is this innkeeper. He's got a stone house, or stone building. You know how many stories it has, and that's useful information. And I pointed out partly because we lose that in subsequent years. We don't have it in every year following. This is 71. We've lost the enumeration of buildings, but we get for the first time a distinction here between can you read and can you write. Before, literacy was read or write. Here, we're distinguishing so that somebody can be recorded as reading but not writing, or vice versa. And we also get this really strange and peculiar Canadian concept of origin. So everyone here is indicating their origin. So what is origin? We all have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. They all come from different places. So where do we get origin from? There weren't rules for it. There was only one rule. The only one rule you could give, that you restricted what you could say, was that you could not give your origin as Canadian. And that in turn gave rise to great frustration to the enumerators. So this is a cartoon at the time. I don't know if you can read it at the bottom, but the enumerator is expressing frustration that you can't say Canadian. Then he's making a joke of it with a reference to the recently published book by Charles Darwin, Origin of the Species. But probably origin here is an attempt to capture the French descended population. It's probably the politics of French and English that give rise to this. So that you want to know how many, so if you're a politician in Canada, and especially if you're a politician in Quebec, you want to know the French descended population within Canada. That's an important political fact. And by denying people the right to, or the ability to say Canadian, it forces everybody to go back to this European country they came from, and it gives you a count then of the French. This is 91. We've come back, and now we do have, again, the building information. So this is a stone house, 3 stories, 10 rooms. This guy's Henry Howitt. He's a younger brother of the John Howitt we saw a little while ago. So I should actually go back. This is John Howitt, the father, here. He's the wealthy guy. He's lost his second wife now, and only his children are with him. So some of his children, some of the male children became farmers, some became physicians, and this guy's also a physician. 91's an interesting census. It was pretty competently done. We get this building materials again. We get relationship to head of household or head of family. So when you see people jumbled together in a family and you don't necessarily know how they're related to each other, well, here you can figure it out. And so here we're looking at a stream of lodgers. So this is a boarding house. We can see that it's a boarding house because of these L's. It's the first census that tells you the place of birth of the father and mother. So it's not just the birthplace of the individual being enumerated, but their parents. So we can, if you want to study second generation effects, so immigrant assimilation, second generation effects, this field is going to be very useful. Over here we get the beginning of employment variables. We're finding out, are you an employee, are you a wage earner? If you're an employer, how many people do you employ? 1901, they go even further. So the bank of information about employment status gets to be very large. A lot of different categories of information, including the first census anywhere that asks, how much did you earn? So we can do studies of how much people earned in Canada 40 years before the Americans can do it. They don't begin to ask about earnings until 1940. The British never start, as far as I can tell. We get a little more elaboration on months in school. Quite interesting. And so this is 1901. Quite interesting here. What's your first language? Is it English? Is it French? And if it's something else, then what is your mother tongue? So this is an enumeration of first language that I'll use it a bit in a minute. We're getting color again, what we had in 1861, that color category has come back. So here's a way to identify someone who's African descended or Aboriginal. For some reason, they asked very precise information on birth date. I have no idea what they did with it or why it was of interest, but it's very, very helpful for anyone working with it. If you want to try to link, so if you've got a parish record, a parish register, and you're trying to connect people into the census, find them in the census. That parish register tells you when they were born. This tells you when they're born. You can connect them up with very little ambiguity. It's extremely helpful. And you also know how long they've been in Canada. So the census has gradually become much more sophisticated, much more information, much more powerful instrument. And that's part of why we create databases now to look for patterns within it. The 1891 and 1901 censuses were the first to enumerate large parts of the West in which very few Europeans lived. And the 1901 census was particularly good at attempting to enumerate the First Nations. This is a table that just draws together what we know about the Indian population in different census years. So in this year, 71, we get that from the category of origin. that origin category. So the only ones who were allowed to say they were, in some sense, North American were the Indians, and of course they had to. And then 1901, we get this other kind of enumeration that the instructions were very explicit. They really wanted to know how many were there. So it's a very different kind of enumeration. So what does it tell us? So the 1901 enumeration, as good as it wasn't great. There's complicated jurisdiction. Census enumerator comes around. If you're going to a treaty reserve, then there's an Indian affairs agent who is responsible for it, and that person feels a little bit threatened by the census enumerator in a different government department. So there are jurisdictional complications here. But it does allow us to talk about the change in population over time, and it's quite fraught, and you're not really sure how much to believe any of this. But if you take seriously the numbers and try to compare, say, 71 with 01, or even 81 with 01, there's no sign of growth in the Indian population of Atlantic Canada. If anything, it's shrinking. Not very much, but it's shrinking. On the other hand, the identifiable First Nations population of Ontario and Quebec is growing. So if the long-run pattern of Indian population in North America is there's a decline, a very serious decline for a long time, and then a recovery, and eventually starts going up again. Ontario and Quebec are already recovering. We're seeing increases in this period, pretty healthy increases if we can believe these numbers. Manitoba, I think, if you look closely, it seems kind of messy. I'm not sure you can see a pattern. But further west, so if you take Alberta and Saskatchewan, so 81, so about 50,000 Indians here identified. So it's probably a bit of a guess. They actually didn't have enumerators going out through all of the West. But then you go to 1901 and count not just Manitoba, but also the Alberta and Saskatchewan, because that was included before. So add up those four numbers, and it's less than 50,000. So if you were to believe these numbers, the population is still shrinking in Western Canada. And of course, the late 19th century, this is a period when large numbers of Europeans are starting to go into the West. The impact of Europeans arriving is perhaps. So these data are coming out of a peculiar kind of exercise. So I went through, or a team of students went through the entire 1901 census, took every male under the age of 30, and said, can we find this person in the military records of World War I? Can we link this 1901 census enumeration to a soldier in World War I? And looking for then the Aboriginal soldiers. And we did find a good number. And I put this up to show something interesting, I think, that something important. And that is that the rate at which we can find people from the census into the Army varies a lot by ethnicity. So the various BC Indians, quite a number of them, of nearly 5,000 we looked for, we only found 15 in the Army in World War I. The contrast here, take the Métis, people had called themselves Métis, it's about 10%. People who were clearly Métis, there's all this terminology is like half-breed or quarter-breed or various adjectives and then breed. So breeds, so mixed race. 7,000 of them, in fact, a much larger number are linked. So what it's saying is that the degree of, to the extent we can believe these numbers, the degree of participation in the First World War by the different First Nations, it varied a lot. Probably not surprising. Some of the First Nations on the East Coast had been living alongside Europeans since the 16th century. In the northwest of BC, Some of them had never lived alongside Europeans as yet. So that difference is probably not very surprising. Because we're linking now the census to the military, we can start to look at these language questions. This is exploiting the language question. And I think this is really interesting, that 1/3 of the mixed race Indians and almost all of the others spoke an Indian language as their mother tongue. So as late as 1901, and even looking at a relatively Europeanized subset that ended up serving in the war, even so, their first language was an Indian language. And there are dozens of Indian languages that get reported here. So that Indian languages are alive and well to some extent in 1901 from this. The other thing that's a little interesting is that to the extent that the language is not Indian, is it English or is it French? It's actually more English than French. And that's true even with the mixed race. And even in Northern Ontario and Manitoba, this is the traditional fur trade heartland where the French-Canadian voyageurs went and collected furs and interacted. So that our image of the Métis, and it's a French word, is that they're French descended. Maybe they're all French descended and have stopped speaking French. I don't know. But even in this group, there are more speaking English than French. So there's a kind of linguistic change that we're seeing echoes of here. That's probably important in a bigger scheme of things. The other reason I end up collecting these military records is to look at how tall people are. And the height of people is kind of a funny indicator. But if you think of what you know about child growth, if a child does not receive sufficient nutrition or does not or is exposed to diseases in youth, you don't realize the growth potential. You don't grow as tall. And so over a whole population, if people in one generation are taller or shorter than another, that's probably telling you that standards of living have changed. So this is a comparison of soldiers in World War I coming from different parts of the country and going east to west. And the line slopes up, and that's saying that people in the west are taller. Soldiers from the west were taller than soldiers in the east. The green line, these are the Indians. So in Ontario and Manitoba, the Indians are actually taller than the white guys, at least amongst those who enlisted in the war. And it's not trivial, the difference. But that's not true out in the west. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, in fact, the Indians are much shorter than the whites who grew up in the same area. It's all done on the basis of birthplace. And that's suggesting that there's something different happening in the west, the very far west. And again, going back to those population numbers, it could be that the arrival of the Europeans in the far west of Canada is starting to have this negative impact on the Indians. That's part of what we're seeing there. Looking at it more closely, so this is now taking just the westernmost Indians, those born in Alberta and Saskatchewan, those born in BC, who served in the war, organizing up by when they're born. And this downward slope of the line is the sign of a population whose health is diminishing. Their health is getting worse, decade by decade. This is pretty clear evidence of that. Of course, it's based on this rather peculiar little, the soldiers in the war, and so you could worry about that a little bit. This goes back to the Victoria Jail. So again, we're looking at how tall people are in the Victoria Jail. The Europeans and the whites born in North America are up here, and a good 2 inches shorter are the Chinese. Not surprising, the Chinese in the 19th century are short. 19th century was a terrible, terrible century in China. So it's not surprising they're short. It is a big, big surprise that this red line is as low as it is. The First Nations on the prairies were by and large pretty tall. That's not true in the West Coast. So that's a different. So these are all things we can learn. They're kind of factoids, if you like, but things we can learn, and that do hint at some bigger social processes. I have one more example I'll try to do quickly here because we're running out of time. So this is it's late 19th century, lots of economic change, things are happening. There are demographic changes too. Fertility is declining, people are marrying later, women more working inside the home, a whole bunch of things. So I want to ask, what about Guelph? Do we see these same patterns in Guelph? And I want to look at one particular aspect of it, which is the ownership of property. So most of you don't know this, but until the late 19th century, in any British common law jurisdiction, a married woman could not hold property in her own name. If she owned property and got married, she had to give it up into a trust that her husband controlled. That married woman could not engage in contracts. So you might have a great idea for a business, but if you needed some capital and had to borrow, you could not borrow. You could not enter a contract. This is a legacy of 17th, 18th century, and that changed in a particular point in time. In Ontario, there are two important acts of legislation. One is 1872, one is 1884. So I want to ask the question, did the property ownership by women change after 1872 and 1884? Guelph turns out to be a really good place to study this because it's big enough that you've got lots of people, but it's not so big that you can't keep track of everybody. So, do we see these demographic changes? No easy way to get that, but the married share of women between the ages of 25 and 29 is falling. So we're seeing that the propensity to marry by the age of 30 has diminished. So some of these people who were unmarried in 1891, they may marry subsequently, but so marriage rates are falling. And not surprising, so are fertility rates. So this is a kind of simple calculation. This is what you do when you have a census and you've got a complete list of everybody in the census. You can resort them and you can say that in families that have a mother in her early 30s, how many children are under 5? So born recently. And you get a number, and then you look 20 years later, and it's a smaller number. So fertility is falling, family size is falling in this period. So those big changes that we know about, they're happening in England, they're happening in the US, they're happening in the rest of Canada, and they're happening in Guelph. We know that here. What about women going into the workforce, working? So the only real way to get at it is reporting an occupation. And in fact, increasing numbers of women report an occupation. It varies a lot whether you're married or single, but it is increasing. So this is the kind of social change that sets the stage for a question about what about property ownership? So these people are working more, are they owning property? And the answer here is yes. So again, just comparing 71 to 91, this is based on taking the property tax records for the city of Guelph, linking them to the census. So I know who owns every property. And for those that are female owned, I can say, well, what share of women then own property? And I can see that it is increasing for, the bigger increases are for the widows and the single women, but even the married women are increasing. If we look at older women, people in their 60s, so for men, the patterns of property ownership would be that every decade there's a higher rate of property ownership until your 50s. And then after the age of 60, then you start declining. In fact, you're passing on property to others. So this is in some sense a better measure here. And we're seeing significant increases in property ownership by women here. This is based on linking tax records to the census. So it looks kind of like it's fitting the story that the law mattered here. The law made a difference. So what about purchases of property? So anyone can go to the corner of Stone Road and Gordon Street and look at the property records for the city of Guelph and say, who's buying and selling property? and everyone's name is given, so you can figure out who's male and who's female, and you can look at the share of property purchases by women. And the key change, remember, the first legislation came in 1872, the second one in 1884. So significant increases roughly in that period. You could ask it a different way. This is share of purchases by women. This is the share of properties owned by women. So this is going back to the tax assessment records, the property assessment records here in it, but it's doing it over time rather than just 71 and 91. And again, it's a somewhat a gradual increase, but it's consistent with the period of the legislation having an impact. We can look at the wills. All wills have to be probated, so they're in the public record after 1889. Even before 89, you find a lot of them. So do women leave wills? And the answer is yes, with a big jump in the late 1870s. You leave a will because you've got some property to pass on. So it's starting to look like suddenly women are having property to pass on. So it is, in fact, consistent. The pattern is consistent. So the final bit of it here is analyzing the wills here. So we can look at the wills. And one thing that you get a lot in the 19th century is a husband or a father might leave property to a wife, a widow, someone who's being widowed, or to a daughter. But very often there are conditions attached. So the widow, on remarriage, has to give up the property to the kids or something like that, those kinds of conditions. So we can look how often you get these conditions. And do they increase, do they not increase? And in fact, they are diminishing pretty rapidly. And this one, the loss if remarry, goes down a lot in the 1870s. And people have looked at this and said this is really because of the legislation. Because after the legislation, the woman could continue to control her own property. The husband did not automatically get control of it. So the father or the husband is a lot more comfortable leaving it to the widow without any conditions, because legally she has the right to continue controlling it. She doesn't automatically have to give it up. Now, what actually happened between two people in a very patriarchal society, we don't know that, but it's an indicator here. And this is distributions in the Testament. So to the extent that you can see a pattern of both men and women in their wills, are they passing on property to sons and daughters equally, or more, so you can see it. So we're comparing before 1884 and after 1884, so the second legal change. There's actually a lot of equal treatment here before 1884. These are male testaments, male wills. But those that are not equal are clearly favoring their sons. They're not leaving very much to their daughters. What changes, though, after 1884 is that blue area suddenly is as big as the purple area. So there's a very big change here. The pattern of passing on bequests has substantially, the gender discrimination or gender difference has disappeared here. It's interesting to look at the testaments of women, too. So is it the same pattern? Do they follow the same pattern? What's your guess? Is it going to look like this? So different patterns here. So the women are not leaving any property to sons. There's no purple here at all, or not favoring their sons. None of them are favoring their sons. But a substantial number are leaving property to their daughters, even before 1884. And then after 1884, that is the dominant pattern. And the sons are favored in a few cases, too. So there's not only can we see there's this very big gender difference in how people pass on bequests, but it changes. For both men and women, it's changing. And it's changing around the time of this legislation. So the quick takeaway from this would be that you could worry a little bit that there's so many big social changes going on that the legislation is maybe partly a result of this big process. It's not just a cause. Maybe it's partly a result. But still, if you hadn't had that legislative change, you wouldn't have seen this very big shift in property in this period. And others who have looked at this period say that this late 19th century, the period in which these laws are introduced, is the biggest this period is the period of the biggest redistribution of property in history that we know. In the 20th century, you do not get shifts like this. So this is an important period in that sense, and it seems to be connected to the laws. So what I've tried to do is give you a little background on the kinds of sources that one can look at, and to a large extent, they're the sorts of sources that genealogists use. It's just we're not looking at one by one, we're looking at big numbers of people, looking for patterns. And towards the end, a couple of case studies, both using the census. One, the First Nations, various aspects of the social reality of the Indians in the late 19th century and how it changed over time, and this question of property ownership using Guelph as a case study. So, thank you.